Hello, it's Psychocore. We present the Dissociation Trap, how the self fades into silence. There is a peculiar fracture within the psyche, subtle, gradual yet catastrophic. Dissociation does not arrive with thunder. It creeps in through silence. It is not a disease of noise, but of absence. The absence of feeling, the absence of self. A patient once whispered to me, "I live half an inch behind my eyes." That was the moment I understood the quiet horror of dissociation. It's not about seeing visions or hearing voices, it's about not feeling at all. The world becomes glass. The body becomes puppet. You move, but you are not there. You laugh, but you are not laughing. You observe, but as a ghost hovering above your own flesh. Carl Jung described the fragmented self as a wounded archetype. Freud referred to defense mechanisms that rupture the ego's integrity. But what neither fully captured was the uncanny deadness, the hollow resonance of existing without inhabiting your existence. Clinical psychology categorizes this under dissociative disorders: depersonalization, derealization, fugue states. But classification is insufficient. What must be addressed is the existential rupture. This is not just pathology, it is metaphysics in decay. Imagine living with your own voice as a stranger's echo. You touch your skin and your hand feels like it belongs to someone else. You speak and wonder if anyone heard you. Not because they didn't respond, but because you're unsure you ever spoke. People think madness is chaos, but this is not chaos. It is emptiness. A white void, a sterile, echoing silence. The dissociated mind is not broken in the way a machine is broken. It is absent the way a god is absent, once worshipped, now silent. It does not scream, it fades. A patient will not say, "I am losing my mind." They will say, "I don't know where I went." This disappearance is gradual. First, it begins in moments. You stare at your hands and they feel artificial. Then it spreads to time. You arrive somewhere and cannot recall how. Eventually, it infects memory. You begin to forget yourself, not in facts, but in presence. You forget what it felt like to be real. The modern world encourages this fracture. Screens replace faces, routines replace rituals. In a hyper-stimulated society, the self is drowned in abstraction. You're not here, you're scrolling, you're not with, you're performing. Dissociation has become a cultural epidemic, a silent inheritance of a disembodied age. There is a passage in Nietzsche's Human, All Too Human that reads, "Man, in his search for meaning, often carves himself into fragments, mistaking analysis for wholeness." Perhaps this is what we are witnessing, a civilization dissecting itself into oblivion. Therapists try grounding techniques. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch. But how do you ground a soul that no longer remembers what Earth feels like? The internal landscape of a dissociated person is not chaos, it is stillness. But this stillness is not peace, it is paralysis. You are suspended in existence like a leaf caught between 2 breezes. You don't fall, you don't land, you float forever. It would be a mistake to view dissociation solely as a disorder. It is a survival instinct, an ancient mechanism of psychological exile. When the world becomes too brutal, the mind learns to uninhabit itself. This is not weakness, it is brilliance taken too far. A child raised in a household of violence may not scream or run. Instead, they retreat inward into a blank interior room. That room becomes a sanctuary, but with time, it becomes a prison. The same walls that protect it begin to suffocate. Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." In clinical practice, we find that dissociation is often inherited, not biologically but emotionally. The parent who never spoke of their own trauma teaches silence as a legacy. What happens when silence is taught before speech? When emotional absence is the first language? The psyche adapts. It divides. It hides. This is not merely psychological fragmentation, it is a systematic refusal to be. A vanishing act rehearsed daily until mastery. Some patients describe themselves as mannequins, others as hollow vessels. These are not metaphors for effect. They are lived realities. To be dissociated is to be aware of one's absence. You know you're not present. You feel it with a grief sharper than language. And society often rewards such absence. We praise detachment. We admire stoicism. We call it resilience, when it is often only refined dissociation. The ability to continue without feeling is mistaken for strength. But when the numbness becomes permanent, the price is unbearable. Your memories blur, your desires dissolve, your name becomes a sound without weight. To live dissociated is to witness life from behind an unbreakable mirror. You see others cry, love, fail, succeed, but all through glass. You mimic, you nod, you react, but you do not feel. You become a master of social pantomime. Wearing expressions like masks at a masquerade you forgot you were attending. There is something especially cruel about being able to observe your disconnection. Many patients are not unaware of their condition. On the contrary, they are painfully aware. They know they are disconnected. They know something is missing, but they cannot locate it. In Freudian terms, this might be the ultimate repression, not of an idea, but of the self. The ego attempts to preserve coherence, but at what cost? The cost is authenticity. The cost is the organic, chaotic, overwhelming texture of aliveness. There are moments when the dissociated person almost returns. A scent, a note of music, a glance, something pierces the veil. For a moment, the world becomes vivid. The body feels inhabited. The self pulses again. But just as quickly it vanishes, the curtain falls, the actor retreats. Philosopher Michel Foucault once wrote of the invisible architecture of power. But in the dissociated self, there is an invisible architecture of absence, a void that is structured, ordered, rehearsed. It becomes one's identity to have no identity. Therapists who confront dissociation often walk a razor-thin line. Pushing too hard may fracture the patient further. Moving too slowly may reinforce the numbness. Healing is neither linear nor assured. It is a flickering, fragile, sometimes illusory process. And yet, there is hope. Not in returning to a former self, but in forging a new one. A self that remembers what it is like to feel, even if only for seconds at a time. What does it mean to feel real? For those outside the dissociative spectrum, this may seem like a strange question. But for the dissociated mind, reality is always at risk of slipping into simulation. Emotions feel performed. Sensations appear staged. Life is witnessed like a distant theater play whose language you once understood but have since forgotten. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote, "The greatest hazard of all to risk being oneself. In dissociation, that hazard becomes unbearable. Being oneself requires feeling, and feeling often means pain. And so the mind performs a quiet calculus. Numbness is safer than suffering. Clinically, we often categorize dissociation as comorbid, attached to trauma, PTSD, borderline personality, severe depression. But these labels, though helpful for research, often do not capture the lived intensity of unreality. A dissociated patient may function, speak clearly, hold a job, attend meetings, but inside they feel as if their soul has been exiled. The brain adapts. Neural pathways reinforce detachment. The longer one remains in the void, the harder it becomes to return. The voice that once said, "This isn't me," slowly fades, replaced by silence. Eventually, even the silence feels normal. And yet many who suffer in this way possess a terrifying clarity. They know they are missing. They carry an invisible grief, not for a lost lover or a dead parent, but for the self they once briefly were. That grief is not always loud. It is slow, chronic, cellular. The tragedy of dissociation is not only in the absence of self, but in the memory of what selfhood once felt like. They remember warmth but cannot feel it. They remember music but cannot be moved by it. They remember love but do not believe in it. And still, life goes on. Bills are paid, meetings are attended, smiles are performed. The world does not pause for invisible suffering. The dissociated self becomes an expert in camouflage. Outwardly successful, inwardly erased. Society calls it high functioning. But what they don't see is the exhaustion, the emotional anemia that results from faking every interaction, from simulating presence without the nourishment of engagement. A particularly articulate patient once told me, "It's like being buried alive but with email." Philosopher Byung-Chul Han speaks of the burnout society where individuals become self-exploiters under the illusion of freedom. Dissociation thrives in such environments. The illusion of choice, of agency, masks the deeper truth. The self has already vacated the premises. We are avatars of productivity, not embodiments of being. Healing begins not with catharsis, but with recognition. You do not fight dissociation by attacking it. You name it. You sit beside it. You learn its patterns. The goal is not to snap out of it. The myth is destructive. The goal is to slowly return, to rebuild neural bridges scorched by trauma and silence. And yet, it's terrifying to return. To feel again is to risk again. Many dissociated individuals fear that reconnecting with feeling will lead to an avalanche of pain they once sealed away. In many cases, they're right. But there's no other way. You cannot selectively numb. To feel joy, you must permit sorrow. To feel love, you must risk loss. To live, you must risk falling apart. That is the paradox of recovery. The path out of numbness is paved with everything you once fled from. There are no shortcuts, no affirmations, no platitudes, no fast-tracked awakenings. Dissociation is not a broken leg. It is the slow erosion of being, and what erodes over years cannot be rebuilt in days. Still, the human psyche is not fragile. It is adaptive. The very mind that built the walls can begin to dismantle them brick by brick. Therapists often describe this process as reintegration. But what does it mean to reintegrate? not to restore a prior self, but to create a self that can hold the fragments together. A self that is not whole in the traditional sense, but coherent enough to move forward. Some find moments of clarity through art, others through movement, through writing, through presence with another who does not demand answers. In such spaces, the silence begins to shift, not disappear, but change texture. It becomes less cold, less alien, less total. Carl Jung spoke often of the shadow, the repressed self that once integrated could restore balance, but in dissociation the entire self becomes shadow. The ego does not suppress an urge or a trauma, it suppresses its own existence. And so the work becomes sacred. To bring light to the shadow not as enemy, but as exiled kin. To understand that what hides does so not out of malice but protection. The return is not cinematic, there is no trumpet, no revelation. There are only moments, the feel of warm water on skin, the sound of rain, the weight of breath in your chest. And for a second you are here. And maybe that second becomes two. And maybe that is enough to begin again. Recovery is not a destination, it is a practice, a series of imperfect returns to presence. For the dissociated, even glimpses of reality must be treated as sacred. You do not demand permanence, you cherish flickers. There is immense courage in simply choosing to remain. To wake each day and say, I will try to feel something today, even if you don't. That choice, repeated, becomes a form of defiance, not against the world, but against the nothingness that once ruled within. The philosopher Diogenes carried a lantern in daylight, searching for an honest man. But perhaps today we must carry a light inside ourselves, searching for the honest self, buried beneath performance, silence, and survival. In time, the self may not come rushing back, but it will send signs. A laugh that feels genuine, a memory that stirs warmth, a moment of stillness that is not empty but full. And as those fragments return, something radical happens. You begin to believe that you are allowed to be here, not as a function, not as a role, not as a mask, but as a living presence, incomplete, imperfect, but real. No longer trapped behind your own eyes, no longer just observing, but inhabiting. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, like, and share the video.